Both of you have covered throughout the course of your campaign. Let's move on to Israel. And Mr. Keyes, what role do you think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict plays in fueling potential terrorism against the United States?
Oh, I think that we have seen in the Middle East, unhappily, that in the context of the ongoing Arab hostility to Israel, it has become an incubator of terrorism. But I think that was partially because of the response that was there from the rest of the world, including some previous administrations, the Europeans and others, who allowed terrorists with the blood still dripping from their hands to sit down at so-called tables of peace negotiations in order to collect the ill-gotten gains that they had achieved by going after innocent lives. I think that's a great mistake. I think the Bush administration
the real question, Mr.
has
Keyes,
followed the real
if I may interrupt, the real question was, to what extent is the unresolved nature of the conflict fueling potential terrorism against the United States? That's what I meant to ask.
No, that's not the real question. The real question is whether or not, by making concessions to terrorists over the course of several decades, we in fact helped to create the mentality that has then led to a widespread and global threat from terrorism. If we had made it clear, as the Bush administration has, that we will not negotiate with those who practice terrorism, then perhaps we wouldn't have encouraged the adoption of terrorism as a strategic weapon on the part of some Palestinian groups, some in the Arab world, who think that they have gotten away with it, they have reaped rewards from it, they have killed innocent lives in Israel, on the Achille Lauro, at the Olympic Games, and at each stage we were willing to go forward with a process that then rewarded them for this terrorist death. I think the real question is whether or not we shouldn't have started to say no to terrorism long before we did. Then maybe we wouldn't have been struck on September 11th.
Mr. Obama, your thoughts on the role Israel plays in the potential motivation of potential terrorists against the United States?
Well, I think that the ideology, the death cult that's perverted one of the world's great religions, doesn't need an excuse like Israel to engage in the kind of violence that people like bin Laden have engaged in. I think that obviously, to the extent that we can arrive at a peaceful settlement in the Middle East, that would be helpful in draining some of the anti-Israeli and anti-American sentiment that exists there. But we've got to take more steps than that. I mean, one of the concerns that I have, for example, is that we have not been particularly aggressive in promoting the establishment of secular schools in the Middle East that would counteract the madrasas that are basically the only education that young Islamic men are receiving in places like Pakistan. So there are a whole host of issues that I think we're going to have to grapple with. This is a battle of ideas and not simply a military battle that we're engaged in the Middle East. And I think that one of the tragedies of the Bush administration is they've been very neglectful of that second leg of the battle.
Let me ask you this, though, along those lines. Today, the Knesset voted a strong vote of support to Prime Minister Sharon's plan to withdraw settlements from Gaza. Is that a sign that the administration's support of Mr. Sharon is well placed?
Well, I think that Mr. Sharon took an enormous risk and an appropriate risk in that particular circumstance, because what you've seen is a failure of the Palestinian leadership to clamp down on the sort of terrorist activities that have been taking place. And for the Israeli government to take this sort of unilateral step, I think is entirely appropriate in terms of protecting their people. Ultimately, what we're going to have to see is the Arab peoples and the Palestinian people develop the sort of legitimate political leadership that is able to negotiate in a nonviolent fashion and have the will to clamp down on terrorism in a way that has not been done.
Let's move on to
what I find it hard to understand.
Go ahead.
Is over the course of time, you have criticized the Bush administration time and again for a so-called failure to engage in the peace process, when in point of fact, when they withdrew and refused to deal with terrorist elements immediately after they had attacked and killed innocent Israelis, they were in fact pursuing the very goal you claim you want to pursue. Because the way to discourage terrorist strategies is to make sure that nobody benefits from terrorist strategies. And that means that you have to be willing to back away from negotiations with those who are sponsoring terrorism, aiding and abetting terrorists, refusing to condemn terrorists, and who think that they can sit down at the negotiating table and reap the rewards of terrorism. And if you're not willing to make those hard decisions and stay out of the process when it serves the interests of the terrorists, then you're not serious, in fact, about changing the way they behave.
I'm not clear about what Mr. Keyes is referring to. I know that when he was ambassador in an administration that was engaged in the Middle East peace process, that His administration, as well as every subsequent administration, has felt that the United States has an appropriate role in seeing if it can move the process forward. And I think for us to suggest somehow that we should abdicate responsibility entirely in the Middle East makes no sense whatsoever.
Let's